Welcome to We Dream, a podcast series by Dream.org, a national nonprofit focused on closing prison doors and opening doors of opportunity into the green economy. We bring people together across divides to create a future with freedom, dignity, and opportunity for all. We dream of a world beyond pollution, mass incarceration, and economic inequality. Then, we work with even the most unlikely of allies to make this dream a reality. On this season of We Dream, we're excited to bring engaging conversations with advocates and experts in the field of criminal justice, digging into how we can reimagine and rebuild a legal system that puts people over punishment. We'll focus specifically on the highly anticipated crime bill expected from the Trump administration, examining what it could mean, why a tough on crime stance is so harmful, and how we can fight back.
And I'm Janos Marton. I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer at Dream.org. I've been working in the criminal justice space for the last 15 years, and this crime bill is freaking me out. So I thought it was important for us to start a podcast to let people know what is coming down the pipeline and what we can do to stop it. And this podcast series is going to be hosted by both me and Naomi.
Yep, and I'm Naomi Garcia-Hector. I'm a program assistant here at Dream.org, where I help drive our advocacy work across a few different campaigns. Excited to be here and talk about this.
So let's jump in. What do we have to talk about?
So Janos, talk a little bit about why we wanted to get into doing a podcast now, and specifically about the crime bill.
Right. I mean, we're doing a podcast about a bill that doesn't even exist yet, which is pretty niche, and that's how podcasting goes these days, I guess. We really wanted to get ahead of the curve. This is going to be the biggest bill of 2026, most likely. It's probably going to be one of the centerpieces of the midterm elections. And even though there is not bill language to be debated yet, what we do know from all the work we've done at the federal level on criminal justice reform, this is a potentially very dangerous bill that will not only lead to a lot more people winding up in federal prison, but could also deeply entrench the powers of a very political Department of Justice that Trump has wielded against political opponents already, and it might give him further powers to do that. So we want to get ahead of the curve. We want to let people know what's coming, but we also want to give people an opportunity to organize, to get together, and to push back and make sure that their legislators know that this is something they need to fight against.
Yeah. But in your opinion, what does it look like to be running a campaign against something? I think so often, we're working to galvanize people to support a bill or to support a certain movement, but in this case, we're in opposition. So how does that look different?
Right. The main difference over the course of my career is the amount of planning and thought we put into trying to win positive campaigns, which makes sense. They're kind of more exciting. They're easier to get fired up about, easier to plan for. We worked on the Close Rikers campaign or the Close the Workhouse Jail campaign, or when I was at the ACLU trying to pass criminal justice bills around the country, we'd always spend sessions planning, strategizing, figuring out who to bring into the coalition, figuring out the right message that would work, figuring out the right day to launch the campaign. Defensive campaigns, by definition, are almost always more chaotic. You sometimes don't even know that a bad bill is coming until it's introduced. They tend to move very quickly. Unlike a campaign where you're trying to win something, you don't really have control over the calendar. You can't say, today is the day we're going to introduce the world to it. You just have to work with what you've got. Now, this crime bill is a little different, in part because of the shutdown. We've known this was coming for a few months, even though nothing was really happening on it. So that gives us the chance to treat this situation with the seriousness of a real campaign, even though this is really a campaign to say no to the crime bill, as opposed to a campaign to pass something.
And what have we learned so far during the Trump administration? This could be a question that could probably take all day.
Yeah, that's a deep question. I think the most important thing we've learned about the passage of bills is the lessons from the one big, beautiful bill, which did a lot of bad things, but it did two things in particular that we care about at Dream.org that were very negative, one of which was rolling back all the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits on green energy, and the other was deep, deep cuts to Medicaid. And what was shocking about the way both of those situations went down is that traditionally, if a member of Congress cares about an issue, even if it goes against something that the leader of his own party wants, that means that those opinions will make their way into the legislative process. For example, a lot of people thought that they wouldn't roll back all the Inflation Reduction Act credits, or they wouldn't completely attack the green economy because so many of the green jobs being created under those programs were benefiting southern states, benefiting red districts. There were a lot of members of Congress from those districts who could point to new plants opening in their district because of the bill. So there were a lot of people who thought the conventional wisdom was that, yeah, they'll roll back some of them at some point, but they're not going to take it, an axe to it. And similarly with Medicaid, Medicaid funds tons of programs that we care about that help people who have mental health issues or addiction issues, or obviously provide the most basic level of healthcare for people who are lower on the economic spectrum. And this affects millions and millions of people in Republican districts, many of whom raised their voices and said, don't cut Medicaid. And the thing that we've learned, to answer your question, is that when it came to the Trump administration putting its foot down and saying, we don't care, we're going to do these things anyway, the entire Republican caucus completely buckled. There were pretty much no votes in opposition in the House or Senate to either of these things. And that's important for us to remember as we go into this crime bill conversation. At Dream.org, we work with conservative organizations, we work with Republican members of Congress, we work with Republican state legislators, and we've done a lot of good things working across the aisle, both passing good legislation, expanding programs, beating back bad things. But this is a little different. If this is going to be President Trump's signature midterm bill, then I don't think we can count on people who have historically been pretty good on issues of criminal justice reform bucking against their party and voting no, which is why it's incumbent on us to make sure that the people who are winnable, Democrats, stand up and fight on this.
Yeah, so it's going to be a hard fight, but I guess the most important ones usually are. So who are we going to bring in for this first conversation? What are we going to dive into today?
Well, we're keeping it local to the Dream Team for this first conversation. We're going to have Kandia Milton, our Government Affairs Director, and Josh Hoe, our Senior Policy Manager. These are two guys who have been involved in both state and federal criminal justice fights for years. They're both very active on the Hill, talking to staffers, talking to members. So they have a sense of both how things normally work and how things have been pretty different during the Trump administration.
Awesome. Let's dive right in.
Let's do it. All right, for our very first episode, we're being joined by two guests from the Dream.org team. First, we've got Kandia Milton, the Government Affairs Director of Dream.org, a longtime Detroit resident. Kandia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Janos. Look forward to our conversation.
And we've got Dream.org Senior Policy Manager, the former host of the Decarceration Nation podcast and long-suffering Dallas Mavericks fan, Josh Hoe.
All right, great to be here. Don't even know what to say after that one.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to talk about the Mavericks today, but we're going to talk about something else that's not going well, the crime bill. I want to start with this. This is mostly going to be both this episode and a lot of our work around the crime bill is going to be about what's ultimately a pretty partisan fight about what Democrats can do to stop a Trump bill. But that's not really how we've operated in the criminal justice space normally. I want to ask you, how has common ground worked for us traditionally in the criminal justice space, and what makes this moment different?
Yeah, Janos, thanks for the question. And I think the level set, really talk about what common ground is, right, and how we look at it. And so we're talking about coming to the table with shared goals and interests, which allows individuals or groups with different perspectives to find some agreement and collaborate around what I would say is mutual interest. And we have, over the years, have quite frankly been effective. I mean, it's at the core of who we are. I think everyone who has been a part of this organization approaches their work with that in mind. And to that end, we've built some very strong relationships with organizations that cross the political spectrum. Some of our stronger relationships are with organizations rather that sit right of the center. And we can name the who's who of those organizations, everyone from American Conservative Union to the Faith and Freedom Coalition to Americans for Prosperity. And I hate to start mentioning names because I'll probably leave someone's name off. So put it to my mind and not my heart should you be left off the list. But, we have stayed at the table and had sometimes very difficult conversations, but through those conversations have built trust with a number of these organizations and have had some success and some wins as a result of building what Sean, our organizing director, would call transformational relationships. Those relationships, as you know, Janos, are not transactional, but rather transformational. And so we've been able to pass legislation. The Federal Prison Oversight Act is one piece of legislation that we partner with organizations sitting both left and right of the center. We almost got done the Equal Act, and that is the bill that would end the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentences. We were very close, and as you know, we were very instrumental in leading a number of the efforts to pass that piece of legislation. That work isn't done yet, and I commit that we're gonna pass it at some point. But also in defeating Senator Marsha Blackburn's Congressional Review Act resolution that opposed home confinement, permanent stay for people who were serving on home confinement, and so we were successful in combating that CRA resolution as well, which allowed people to stay at home vis-a-vis President Biden's order that said that they can finish their time on home confinement. And so we've had some great successes being at the table with organizations that really cross the political divide. And it's, again, at the core of not only who we are as an organization, but I think Dream.org over the years have done an effective job of bringing people into the fold who share that value.
One of the greatest hits, right, is in addition to all the bills that you mentioned, is one that was a little bit older, the First Step Act, which was signed by President Trump during his first term. And we got Josh Hoe right here, who was a part of that team. And so, Josh, I think for people who follow politics now in 2025, including even some members of Congress and some staff, that feels like such a foreign time that there could have been a criminal justice bill that was passed on a bipartisan basis and signed by President Trump. Do you want to just take a minute to talk about not just what the bill was, but, what it was like to work in that kind of environment and to get that kind of bipartisanship to get something like that done?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, it was a great honor to work on the First Step Act. A lot of the work that we all do in the organization is kind of based in this notion that liberty is a good thing. And since the First Step Act passed, it's brought over 40,000 people back to their communities and continues to allow people to earn early release and sentence reductions. I have people who've come up to me at many events and at places that I've been to tell me that the First Act is why they're home right now. And those moments are really powerful, and it really kind of reminds me why we do this work. And, as for the feelings and all that kind of stuff, Van Jones and Jessica Jackson, who were running what was called Cut 50 at the time, it subsequently has become Dream.org, had this wild vision for bringing unlikely allies together and passing this bill. Everyone from the president's son-in-law, which they knew was someone whose father had done time. And
that's Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner, yes. And a lot of Republicans who were sympathetic to criminal justice reform, and a lot of people wouldn't have seen that there was this kind of rump of Republicans who were sympathetic to criminal justice reform, but they did. And then there was the Democrats who were also enthusiastic for criminal justice reform, and the goal was to try to find a way to knit them all together. And I think they landed that plane after about a 2-year battle. It's a perfect example of what happens when you get both sides on board. It was originally only a bill about creating earned credits and making some quality of life changes for the people who are in our federal prisons. But because this coalition came together, pressure built in order to get that part of the bill passed. We needed the votes of people on the left and the progressive left, and what they wanted was sentencing reform. And so as a result of working together, we actually got a much more impactful bill, and it impacted more lives. So I think their theory of the case was a great theory, because if you can identify the areas of the different sides of government, and you can identify how you're going to get the executive to get on board, you have a real possibility to move things. And as Kandia will probably tell you too, the real benefit of it is if you get a bipartisan bill and it passes, it's more durable than a bill that passes by a bare majority. And in this case, we had a broad bipartisan vote in both houses. So, I think
85 to 15 in the Senate, which is a high watermark of sorts, right? We had 85 U.S. senators vote for a criminal justice bill. So That's not happening next year. So what's different? Why can't we just do that this time around? And I'll throw that to either of you.
Well, I mean, I think the short version is because the political realities, there isn't that kind of willingness to work in coalition right now. There's a feeling, I think, on the right that doing bipartisan bills actually hurts the people on the right electorally. And I think on the left, they don't have a lot of trust in any kind of work that they do with the Republicans right now. And so I think part of our challenge is to try to find ways to build new coalitions and to bring people back together who aren't together now. I don't know what Kandia's take on that is.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Josh, is that if we take a look at the relationships that you and I are building outside of the halls of Congress, I mean, we are still at the table with the organizations that I mentioned earlier. And we're all sort of having conversations and wrestling with this issue of how we can bring both sides to the table. And so I don't know that I could add anything to what you said, because I think your analysis was dead on. But there is, outside of Capitol Hill, if you would, there is a growing desire for there to be folks coming to the table as opposed to pushing away and really putting down the weapons, if you would, but rather finding ways to find common ground and bring folks to the table to advance really some policies that will impact public safety. All these conversations around a crime bill, there are some pieces of legislation that are pending out there that Congress supported in the last session of Congress that would really help to improve public safety, and everything from violence intervention to really full implementation of the First Step Act.
I also think even I think even things like what we were talking about just a few months ago, just that what should have been easy bills to pass, like changes that allow kind of a bridge for people incarcerated at the federal level to come back with Medicaid benefits and things like that, just things that would immediately have a public safety impact, because if someone comes back without their medication, they're probably not in as good a situation to reenter as someone who is on their medication. So I think there are even simple solutions that could have been passed and hopefully will still be passed.
And that bill used to be supported by Senator J.D. Vance. So yeah, I think what I'm hearing from both of you is, if we were seriously having a conversation about how to make this country safer, we don't have to make up what the ideas are. There actually are perfectly decent bills out there, many of which were supported by large numbers of Republicans and Democrats in the past. And if we passed all those things, if that was the so-called crime bill, then we'd be having a very different conversation. However, that's not what's going on. We're going to talk about the reasons for that. To me, personnel is policy. When you talk about Jared Kushner being involved in the First Step Act because his father had served in prison and he wanted to bring that empathy into the Trump administration. Now you've got Stephen Miller, who is really what is the opposite of empathy? I mean, surely one of the least empathetic humans out there directing White House policy. You're going to have a much worse set of bills. And I said earlier that we don't have bill language yet, so people understand that. But we're spitballing a little bit here based on intelligence that we've heard. But what are some of the more troubling potential aspects of the crime bill that you could see coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think one that's very concerning is the president. One of the only things the president said is he wants in a potential crime bill is serious action against what he calls cashless bail, essentially what we would call or would have called bail reform that's happening across the states. And I think that at the federal level, we'll see something that deals with cashless bail, removes the opportunity for bail for a lot of people. And I think he's going to put a lot of pressure on states to roll back their own bail reform using things like what are called burn jag grants and things like that. And, I think we all know.
Sorry, just so people can follow along. Burn jag grants, this is how the Department of Justice gets a lot of money to states and municipalities. So they could say in this bill, if you have bail reform, we're not going to give you money, which will essentially target places like New York, New Jersey, Illinois. The war on blue states continued.
Yeah, I absolutely think that'll happen. I think another kind of area of this where you'll probably see something like this is attacks on so-called progressive prosecutors. I think you're going to see the same kind of leverage used in those instances. In terms of sentencing, I think you're going to see what we've seen across the country in the last 2 years, which is a lot of tougher sentencing laws. You'll see probably expansion of mandatory minimums. You'll see truth in sentencing provisions. You'll see 3-strike style provisions. You're definitely going to see increased penalties for juvenile defendants. I think you're probably going to see penalties for shoplifting, organized retail theft, and for carjacking. I think those things will probably all be there at some level too. And I think the reason I think this is because, in my opinion, the DC bills that have recently been going through are kind of a mirror for what we'll probably see in the larger crime bill. And these are things that were in the DC bills.
Just for people who haven't been following closely, what Josh is referring to is there have been, 14 or 14 bills relating to Washington, D.C., which Congress does have the power to set policy for. And all these bills are, attacking things like the way police reform works or the way juvenile justice works, all the things Josh mentioned. So we're getting a bit of a preview in terms of how Republicans want to regulate the whole country by how they're trying to regulate D.C.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see expansion of the death penalty. I think you're going to see wider application of the death penalty in areas like drugs, carjacking, sex offenses. And I think you're going to see maybe even a lot of death penalty kind of stuff when they can tie it to what they're calling organized crime, which is more probably politically motivated than what we would traditionally consider to be organized crime, using RICO cases to kind of go after folks.
I mean, we've seen Ted Cruz talking about how Act Blue could be involved in organized crime, and by that, his definition of organized crime is basically raising money for the Democrats is, what should be illegal. I mean, it's rather absurd, but if you just take him at his literal word, Ted Cruz isn't alone. There have been other Republican officials who have been suggesting that what Democrats are doing in an attempt to win elections is illegal. So crime bill that gives the Department of Justice more power to expand RICO and determine what is organized crime and what isn't, could have catastrophic consequences for our democracy beyond just putting people from historically marginalized communities in prison.
Yeah, and interesting, Janos, one of the things that I've, in addition to what Josh has mentioned, one of the things that I've been hearing too as relates to these grants, which also includes community violence intervention grants, is that in order for some of these cities to be eligible for them, there must be some type of partnership with immigration enforcement between the local law enforcement and immigration enforcement. So a relationship between ICE and your police departments. That is also troubling given what we are seeing right now and what's going on in a lot of major cities throughout the country.
Finally, I think you're going to see an expansion of presidential powers under the guise of crime that could be used in multiple different areas, kind of like what happened under the Patriot Act. I think you're going to see, like we talked about RICO a little bit, I think you're going to see a broadening of surveillance technology. I think you're going to see parts of the law that will talk about military and police deployments. I think they're going to use anti-terrorism legislation to justify some of this, and I think they're even going to use IRS powers at some point, most likely. And finally, I think they're going to try to find some ways to include things that justify the president's ability to deploy troops domestically. So I think you're probably going to see a lot of that, and some more amnesty for police. The one thing Trump has consistently said through his entire campaign is that police should have absolute immunity, which,
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
What's interesting too is you talk about these sort of expanded anti-terrorism initiatives. These initiatives tend to last even beyond the moment, right? And so this then becomes a tool beyond this moment that will become a part of the sort of enforcement culture for years to come. And we saw that in post 9/11 legislation that was passed and executive orders that were passed. They've passed down from one president, and it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or a Republican. It passed down throughout, from one president to another. And we have them with us today.
Before we wrap up for this episode, we've thrown a lot at people. And I think that if you're feeling rattled after hearing all that, that's kind of the goal, because the goal of the Republicans on this, of Stephen Miller and company, is to work on this through the year, and then January or February, spring this on to the Congress and maybe pass it quickly. After all, the speed at which they dismantled Medicaid was, I think, shocking to a lot of people. And of course, to use this and weaponize this in the midterm elections. So our goal is to be ready. But when the moment does come, it does have to pass Congress. You do have how a bill becomes a law is relevant here, because this is not a budget process. Kandia, could you just talk a little bit about, so how would this actually work? What is it? Would it have to go through committees? Just give people a little bit of an understanding of how this crime bill could come to pass and where the opportunities would be to stop.
We anticipate this to really be fast tracked, if you would. Usually, 3% of the bills introduced are passed, but this right here, we anticipate it to move fairly quickly. And so the bill would essentially, in our estimation, be introduced at the Judiciary Committee level, where typically there is a hearing. We expect that hearing to be fast-tracked. There's a markup, and given the votes in that committee, we anticipate that markup to happen.
So markup is when the actual bill language is presented, essentially.
Yes, the bill language is presented. Essentially, the sponsor of the bill would have all of the votes lined up, because you don't go to markup without those votes lined up. So have all their votes lined up, and then the chairman would call for a vote, and then we anticipate that bill will pass out of committee fairly easy. And if we're doing what we anticipate doing, making certain that Democrats hold the line, we anticipate it to be a party line vote. But certainly, as you spoke of, is that we really do need to take action and shore up our Democratic colleagues on a vote like this. Josh, I saw you jumping in.
Well, I was just going to say that there's two times when people can introduce amendments. One is during markup, and the other one's on the floor vote, during the floor vote. So amendments could theoretically, say the votes are lined up, but the Democrats want to cause a lot of trouble, they could introduce a lot of amendments and, play around with that. This is something that happens very often.
And if it is a party line vote on the floor, then Republicans would be favored to deliver in the House, although let's remember that Republicans do have a history of not having their act together when it comes to big votes. So we should not take for granted that they can pass this and rather fight it tooth and nail. And then the Senate, Kandia, it takes 60 votes, right?
Correct.
And so the key here is that it cannot be a successful party line vote in the Senate. And that is what gives us our huge opportunity. And that's why we're going to need people to get involved. And a little bit, Naomi and I will be sharing how people can get involved. But certainly, when you look around at senators and House members from the Democratic side who have been wobbly on this issue and other issues, that's who we're going to be focused on. And that's where we're going to need everybody's help to organize.
We just saw just yesterday, this is a problem, making sure that the caucus, the Democratic caucus, is unified. We just saw with the bill to lift the shutdown, that it's very hard to keep Democrats in line right now. So the more pressure we can put on them, the better.
Exactly. Well, thank you both. Thank you so much for your work through the years, through your work on this fight. And I'm sure that as we run this podcast through the fight along the crime bill, we'll be seeing both of you plenty down the road. So thank you. Kandia Milton, Josh Hoe. Catch you later.
Thanks for listening. It's Naomi again, and I'm back here with our host, Janos. If you're interested in following our amazing guests, Josh and Kandia, on socials, check the links in the description. You can find them on Blue Sky, X, and LinkedIn. We're recording this closing on November 20th, 2025, and we want to round this out with a few relevant news updates. So first off, you heard Josh mention the government shutdown in this episode. As of November 12th, 2025, the government is back open. That marked a 43-day shutdown, making it the longest shutdown in American history. You also heard reference to some DC crime bills. Janos, can you give us a brief download on what those are and any relevant updates?
Absolutely. So there have been 14 bills moving through the House relating to Washington, D.C. and its criminal justice policies. These are all efforts by Republicans to undermine D.C. home rule and overturn D.C. policies for political points. And tragically, a certain number of Democrats have gone along with every single vote. Mileage has varied. So last night, there were two votes. One was overturning D.C. police reforms. These are reforms that were passed in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and had provisions that I think are pretty common sense, like police officers with violent histories shouldn't be allowed to be hired by the department. Unfortunately, there were 20 House Democrats who voted with Republicans to pass this bill. And then there was a second bill relating to DC's bail policies. Now, DC has had cashless bail, meaning that it assesses whether somebody should remain in jail on the basis of factors other than whether they can afford to pay it. And that's been their policy since 1992, during which crime has decreased dramatically in Washington, D.C. However, using their traditional fear-mongering tactics, Republicans have voted to overturn this bail policy that, again, has been in place since 1992. On that bill, 28 Democrats voted with Republicans to overturn it. So we have our work cut out for us, because these are the exact same Democrats who have repeatedly voted for against sensible criminal justice reform policies and for Republican policies that will ultimately undermine our safety. And we're going to have to make sure we reach these Democrats in advance of the crime bill. And we have to make sure that this sort of Democratic attrition doesn't follow us to the Senate, where they will be taking up these bills potentially later this year.
Thank you. Thanks for those updates. So between these episodes here at dream.org, we're hard at work on the state and federal level working to advance progressive criminal justice reform, but we absolutely cannot do this work without the help of community advocates like you all. We encourage you to get involved in this upcoming national crime bill fight. While the anticipated Trump administration crime bill has not yet been introduced, when it does, time will very much be of the essence. So you can join our national response team by clicking the link in the description. By joining, you'll be a part of a rapid response crew that'll be the first to act when Congress tries to push another harmful crime bill through. You'll get real-time updates, action alerts, and the chance to mobilize your community when it counts the most. Protecting our people does not start when the bill drops, it starts now. We'll be back in another 2 weeks' time, but for now, be well, and remember, don't quit your daydream.